Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of big stories to get to this morning. First of all, President Obama returned to the White House for the first time since he was in office. We will tell you why and what it means for the state of the Biden presidency. Also, some new developments in the union-busting campaign from Starbucks. So they kicked out their old CEO, brought back Starbucks founder Howard Schultz. He made some very illuminating comments, and also within an hour of making those comments, they had fired one of the key worker organizers. So we will break all of that down for you. Also, some new developments out of Truth Social.
Oh my God.
Some new reporting on it. You know, I've been doing my own little journalism. I think I'm still like 280,000th on the wait list. So yeah, Truth Social not ready for me, apparently. Not ready for my truths. And Christian Smalls, the president of Amazon Labor Union that was victorious in that fight to organize a warehouse on Staten Island. CNBC not only had to have him on, they had to take him seriously. Like, I don't know that I ever expected that would happen in my lifetime, but they still managed to be like obnoxious and condescending and patronizing. So we'll break all of that down for you. Also, a story you don't want to miss about the iron workers. Saagar is breaking down Elon Musk having the largest share of Twitter and what that means and his views on that. I will be talking about a new leaked memo revealing the words that Amazon is going to ban their workers from saying, words that include things like unions and freedom. But we're going to start with the very latest out of Ukraine.
All right, so with Ukraine, the president making some big news here. Speaking again off the cuff, calling Putin not only a war criminal, but asking for him to be put on trial. Let's take a listen.
You may remember I got criticized for calling Putin a war criminal. Well, the truth of the matter, you saw what happened in Bucha. This warrants him, he is a war criminal. But we have to gather the information. We have to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to continue the fight, and we have to gather all the detail so this could be have a war crime trial. This guy is brutal, and what's happening in Bucha is outrageous, and everyone's seen it. No, I think it is a war crime.
What are you going to do about it, sir? Are you going to do more sanctions on Russia?
I'm seeking more sanctions, yes. I'll have time to announce that to you.
So interesting choice of words there by the president. You could see he was specifically asked to call it a genocide. He said no. Again, I've explained about why that carries weight in terms of how the United States is going to brand somebody. But war criminal itself was an extraordinary thing for him to say. Once again, I don't think either of us disagree Putin is a war criminal. The problem with Biden is he said it off of the cuff in response to a reporter, and then the administration had to be like, oh, well, here's the evidence. Now, in the specific instance that he's talking about here, the images coming out of Bucha are horrifying, absolutely terrible. But whenever you brand somebody a war criminal, of course, you need evidence. And here's part of the issue. Just this morning, Krystal, we don't have time to get it made, but the Pentagon says they cannot independently confirm atrocities in Ukraine's Bucha. Now, I don't doubt that they happened. The circumstances through which they did obviously need to bear an incredible amount of investigation. You should not put it past the Russians whatsoever in order to do something so barbaric and terrible in terms of war. That all being said, the reason why it matters is because all of this is once again creating the conditions through which only the end of the Putin regime is an acceptable outcome to the United States, who of course is a major guarantor in the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia at this time, and it just makes peace even more likely. I hate having to do some of these segments too because it's so easy for bad faith actors to misconstrue this as apologism. Who is apologizing for Putin? Nobody. But the world is a horrific place. We still met with Kim Jong-un, even though he's literally guilty of genocide against his people. He's got nuclear weapons. It's because sometimes security interests trump some of these things. As horrible as that may sound, that is simply the way that the world works.
I don't think there can be any doubt now, given these latest comments, which, yeah, they're off the cuff, but to me, they felt very planned and intentional. It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't casually done. This was an intentional choice of words and intentional direction. I don't think there can be any doubt whatsoever that what Biden did sort of accidentally stumble into saying, that Putin, quote, cannot remain in power, is the actual end goal of this administration. Because the reality is they are not doing anything to push forward peace negotiations, and they are doing everything they can to try to pressure Putin's regime, to try to punish Russia, to try to make life difficult for them. And as we covered yesterday, not only have the sanctions not been as effective as they wanted them to be, but in reality, all they're doing is strengthening Putin's hand and the hand of the regime within Russia and making it much more likely that he stays in power, basically as long as he wants to and as long as his life continues. So, and that, by the way, is not like a veiled call for him to be assassinated. I'm just literally saying like, he will live out his life in Russia as a leader of Russia if that is indeed what he wants.
Right.
The Biden administration is doing everything they can to cause that to happen. I mean, all of their actions so far have backfired. I also think it's very revealing, the questions that the media ask him there. None of the questions are like, well, what does this mean for peace? How are you going to let Russia back into the community of nations when you call him a war criminal and you want him to be on trial? You know, how are you going to be able to negotiate, or how is Zelensky going to be able to negotiate with someone who you've said should be put on trial for war crimes? How's that going to work out? So if you care about the lives of Ukrainians and ending this brutality, what you should be doing relentlessly is pushing for that negotiated settlement. And whether it's his off-the-cuff remarks that he's a war criminal, that he's a butcher, that he cannot remain in power, and now what seems to be very intentionally chosen words about he should actually face trial as a war criminal, all of those words make it much more difficult to get to that end goal that we all should be wanting.
Yeah, that's right. And look, even in terms of the International Criminal Court and all that stuff in The Hague, the United States is not even a party to the Hague Convention. Very much because we don't want international jurisdiction over our troops. I actually support that, by the way. But
well, remember, we just had during the KBJ confirmation hearings,
that's
like
true,
all this meltdown. How could you call George W. Bush a war criminal? So we're complete hypocrites on all of this. It's, you know, and so we don't have a lot of standing in the world to be throwing around the words war criminal.
Really what it is that whenever it comes to international law and jurisdiction and all this, it's nonsense. It's great power conflict. It always has been and will be until the end of time. And really the reason why that I look at this and I see no other ability for the administration under this current regime in order to call for the end and see it only as the acceptable way for Putin to fall out of power, you and I just know how unlikely that is. So now, as Ross Douthat pointed out in his column, which we brought everybody yesterday, the flat kind of frozen relations with Russia seem like the most likely scenario, where Russia will declare some sort of fake victory domestically. However, they will still have some occupation of Ukraine. How the Ukrainians themselves are actually going to go about this, obviously that also remains unclear. But that means that there's no off-ramp for sanctions to come off and for Russia to then come back into any sort of G7 international community aspect. So then what happens? Well, we live in this kind of like perma-frost relations in quasi-Soviet Union era relations with Russia. That doesn't seem good for anybody who's involved. And actually, when it comes to Putin, that means that he has a 100% solidification of power. In terms of what we were talking about yesterday, we talked about how this oligarchs are now 100% united behind Putin. That may sound like a misnomer, but it's really not, because a lot of these oligarchs in the 2010s, they had independent power bases. Yes, they were made from Putin, but they were billionaires in their own right. They had assets in Europe. They had the ability in order to cavort around the world and Saint-Tropez and like all these places. Now, with the sanctions, they have no choice but to be 100% behind the Putin regime when maybe previously they were 85%. We've consolidated a lot of the power around him. And in terms of the actions the administration is taking here, there is no off-ramp in sight. Let's put this up there on the screen. So this is a new one from CNN, and you should believe them whenever it comes to weapons transfers. They say, U.S. is expected to help facilitate the transfer of tanks from NATO allies to Ukraine, according to senior U.S. officials. The tanks will be Soviet-era T-72s, with Ukrainian military has the experience operating, and will be delivered, quote, within days, not weeks. Now, that's not enough, though, for some members of Congress. Let's put this one up there on the screen. This one also is very important. There is a bipartisan coalition of 36 lawmakers, some of the people who are most praised here in D.C. because they, voted for the impeachment of Trump. Okay, apparently that's the only thing that matters. You read a little bit further, these 36 lawmakers have a list of weapons that are directly being requested by the Ukrainian government. So the problem here is that the Ukrainian government is delivering these lists to Congress because the administration is not necessarily giving them 150% of what they want. The administration is urging the U.S. to provide long-range surface-to-air missiles, fighter aircraft, anti-ship missiles and other weapons, some of which are not being transferred by NATO and by the United States because they could be offensive in nature and not defensive. So you continue to see a bipartisan push, very much acting on behest of the Ukrainians. And it's hard to parse this by reiterating the Ukrainian cause is just. I don't blame them for trying to do everything within their power in order to defend their nation. I would do the same thing if my country was invaded. However, we are an independent partner. Yes, we support Ukraine. To what degree and more, we have to balance with our own legitimate security interests. And this is thinking and nuance that appears to just have disappeared. I think a lot of it, Krystal, is kind of a decadence of the West, where we have the hubris to think that we can do whatever we want without consequence.
With no consequence.
How many times in the 20th century do we need to, or in the 21st century, do we need to figure out that's wrong? Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. We can continue to go down the list. Did any of those work out? No, they were complete disasters. The world is a multifaceted, complicated place, and yet we see none of this thinking pervading in Washington.
Yeah, I think it's really important to underscore there's a very good reason. It's not just arbitrary that the Biden administration has said no thus far to what these lawmakers and the Ukrainian government are asking for. So when you're talking about surface-to-air longer-range surface-to-air missiles, fighter aircraft, anti-ship missiles, you're starting to get into now offensive capabilities. That will 100% be seen as an escalation by Russia. No doubt about it. And the longer this conflict goes on, and the more you have this step-by-step escalation, the more you risk a broader confrontation. The Russians, as much as this is 100% an existential threat to the Ukrainians, the Russians see this fight as existential as well.
Yeah.
And they are not going to accept a, complete surrender and we're sorry and here's your territory back. That's not going to happen. So we have to figure out ways to empower Zelensky to be able to negotiate a peace. You have to remember, he's in a very difficult political situation here because you have, on the one hand, Ukrainians who are very emboldened and should be rightfully proud of the way that their people have fought and the way that they've been able to push Russia back to basically just the east and the south now of Ukraine. But on the other hand, the reality is that, a bloody stalemate is going to be absolutely horrific, that Russia does have additional resources that they can decide to bring to bear. Putin would have to make a difficult political choice there as well. But you have to understand that failure is not an option for the Russian state either. So the more that you escalate, the more that you send in offensive weapons, the more you are risking that gambling for resurrection scenario that we've talked about so much here, where they do something that seems like it might be crazy if you're looking from an outsider, but they see as like their last chance to sort of save their nation and accomplish their objectives.
Yeah, the one pathway off of this is some sort of peace deal. We should be doing everything that we can in order to ensure that happening. And I just checked the very latest. All signs actually point against it. Zelensky today is speaking towards the United Nations Security Council about Bucha and the evidence of Russian war crimes. The Russians say that they're going to respond and prove that it wasn't them. We'll see. In terms of the EU and others, they said they're going to be toughening sanctions against Russia today. I honestly want to know what is left within the arsenal. Same with the United States, very likely to act in concert. And in terms of those peace deal,
the big thing for the Europeans is cutting off their
they're not going to do it though.
Of Russian oil.
Yeah. We all know they're not going to do that. Then they would literally be in poverty within the next month. So some of this is chicanery and fake on their part as well. And there's quite a bit of virtue signaling that's happening. But in terms of the latest, that's where things are. The administration pushing things in one way. Zelensky also very much going within that vein. Peace talks, no update over the last several days. And unfortunately, that's where things are.
Well, and the last thing I'll say about this on the sanctions is, as we covered yesterday, it is increasingly clear that the indiscriminate sanctions that we have levied against Russia have backfired. They have not been effective. And yet, the media doesn't process that information. Our lawmakers don't process that information because they're on this one-track direction of we have to make them pay, we have to hold Putin accountable, when that shouldn't be the end goal at all. First of all, the Russian citizens, once again, did not do anything wrong. They don't deserve to be punished, period, full stop. But second of all, my goal isn't to make them pay. My goal is to end this conflict and to have peace. That never seems to be the thinking here. And so they're not able to evaluate the fact like, okay, we tried this direction. It's very clear it's not working. And not only that, it's actually strengthening Putin's hand and it's backfiring. What are some other directions we can pursue? Instead, they just say, oh, well, like 90% of what we can do on sanctions doesn't work. So how about we try 100%? How about we just double down on the same failed strategy that hasn't worked out to this point?
Yeah, look, we need an end game. Sanctions can be a tool as long as there is an actual result that is desired. And unfortunately, this current result that the administration has is one that could actually probably only be accomplished by military aims, and even that would be a disaster. So then they're settling for some middle ground on a moralistic basis, which sounds nice and can make people feel better, but may not necessarily accomplish the actual goal that anybody actually wants as a result of this conflict. So it's a bad situation at the end of the day.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.